First, I want to say thank you to Ebony for the very kind and gracious invitation. As I was just saying, I was and still am an educator at heart, although I'm in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. So it's really a pleasure to be with and work with and talk with educators. So let me survey the room. How many undergraduate students do we have here? Okay, graduate students. Okay, faculty. Excellent. Staff? Okay. College education majors? Interesting. Someone in the STEM field? All right. All right. Now I know the lay of the land. So, all right. So let's get started. So how many of you have heard that there is an issue as it relates to the number of women of color, African American, Native American, Latinx, and Asian American women in STEM? How many of you have you heard? Yeah, pretty much everybody. And so I wanted to begin with what unfortunately has become relatively obvious, that yes, there is an issue as it relates to the percentage of women of color earning a bachelor's degree. I just took one swath in computer science. In fact, what's really disturbing is from 2005 to 2014, there's a decrease of African American women earning their degrees in computer science, and also a decrease of Native American, Alaskan Native women. And it was never particularly very high. So we know that there's an issue. We know that there's a problem, but why? And a lot of times there's this belief it's because we lack motivation, that we lack interest, or most recently, we lack grit, right? And so, and we know that grit, this is the Merriam-Webster, but if we look at some more social science research, grit has to do with the individual not being persistent, not being out there all the time. It's about the individual not doing something. And I want to problematize this belief, not only because it is a problem, but I want us to think about how the rhetoric of lacking grit can be unpacked using an intersectional lens. That if we look at real life implications, particularly for critical pedagogy, girlhood studies, and the pragmatics of developing programs that are attempting to right the ship and not broaden the pipeline, but ensure that more women of color are able and interested in continuing in STEM fields, I think this grit argument is incredibly wrong. Let's start with intersectionality, and I'm thinking particularly of the newest book by Collins and Bild, in which intersectionality, yes, it has to do with the intersecting axes and that we don't stand on one side of the road or the other. I'm not just a woman. I'm not just an African-American woman. I'm not just an African-American woman who is a mother or a wife. That we have multiple identities, but there's more to that that is of interest to me. As a theory, intersectionality has to do with power, an individual's access to power, an individual's operationalization of power, and what they do with that power. Also, intersectionality has to do with relationality and context. Relationality, in my interpretation and reading others' work, has to do with the interpersonal, and it's not an either or, it's an and both. But that and both, and I'll play this out in greater terms, also is dependent upon context. Where is it more important that my relationships with others are built on my race and gender as opposed to perhaps my religious affiliation and sexual orientation? And then finally, what seems to be missing a lot from discussions of intersectionality is that it is a dialogical activist process. So as a theory, it's not simply for theory's sake, but how do we integrate critical praxis and critical inquiry so that we can make movement as a society? I love this quote that intersectionality has working at the intersections as an analytical strategy or approach to understanding human life and behavior, rooted in the experiences and struggles of disenfranchised people. It is also an important tool linking theory with practice that can aid in the empowerment of communities and individuals. And so what does this all mean, especially as we think about those depressing statistics that I shared about women of color? So if we look at power, a lot of times we say, okay, here's an example of a tech company or a social institution or some other organization. They have an African-American woman or African-American men. They're diverse. Isn't that great? There's a couple of people who are not representing the dominant culture. But for me, I'm interested in saying, even if we have Black and brown bodies in a particular space, what type of power are they wielding and for whom? And so this is just a quick research study that spanned 2007 to 2015, database of San Francisco Bay Area workforce. And it looked at technology companies between that time period in San Francisco. And it said, let's look at what's called the EPI, which is the Executive Parity Index. And what we see in this graph, and may be difficult to see, is that in the span of 2007 to 2015, white women actually went up from negative 12% to 12% in terms of becoming an executive in these companies. But for everyone else, women of color and men of color, there is no parity in terms of becoming an executive, one of the most powerful positions in San Francisco tech companies. But then I said, okay, well, maybe executive level, not everyone wants to. So they also conducted the study in terms of management parity, similar. Where are we, meaning women of color in particular, as it relates to ascending to management positions in these tech companies over from 2007 to 2015? And as you can see, not so good. So do we have access to power even though we may be occupying the exact same space? Not according to this report. When I think about relationality and context, I think particularly how Collins and Bild say that different people can occupy the same context but have much different interpretations of it. And if we link this particularly to ideas of girlhood studies, Jessica Ringhouse, she describes the commonplace neoliberal educational discourse of girls in particular, casting them in an all too simplistic binary. You're either empowered consumers or winners in the digital space, or vulnerable victims of sexualized society, end of quote. And that the images of girls using digital media to harass other girls or to communicate trivial information concerning their day and their artless attempts to justify adult power over female students, that doesn't tell the whole picture as it relates to relationality and context. And so fast forward to this particular slide. This was a study that was done, and it's called Double Jeopardy. And it was showing what are the experiences of women of color who finish their degrees. They get STEM. They have a degree in science or technology, engineering, math, and they get a job in science, technology, engineering, and math. What happens to them in these science, technology, engineering, and math spheres, in the industries? And what we see is that there are multiple and unfortunate microaggressions that occur at a disproportionate level to certain women. So specifically, African-American women, again, they have their degrees, they have the jobs, but they are 77% more likely to have to provide evidence of their competence. It's not enough that they earned their degrees in some of the most challenging disciplines. They still have to earn they have to prove themselves. And if we go on, and a more recent report that looked at, and it just came out in 2017, as to why are individuals leaving particular industries. It's not because of lack of money per se, and it's not because of lack of supposed job security, but it's because of unfair treatment, where underrepresented women leave, costing the company, and I'm talking about in an aggregate, $16 billion a year because of unfair treatment. Finally, when I think about critical praxis and critical inquiry, does anyone remember the Google, what happened with Google and HBCUs? Yes? So some yes, some no. Okay, so my dear colleague, Jaquita Thomas, who's a professor at Auburn, we're working on a study as it relates to critical praxis and critical inquiry and the attempts that some industries are attempting to make to create more inclusive environments in their industries. And Google is an example. So I'm not saying anything that has not happened. So they had, they meaning Google, they partnered with HBCUs to have what was called a Google in Residency program. And they sent 1 or 2 individuals to HBCUs, listen to what I'm gonna say, to teach them to be Googlers. So individuals from Google would go down to HBCUs and teach them to become Googlers with the intent that they would learn how to be Googly to then become workers in Google. Well, what happened? Unfortunately, it didn't last very long, because a lot of the individuals who were participating in the program, meaning the students from the HBCUs, there was little to no attempt of the Googler in residency to understand the culture of the students. There was little or no attempt to understand that HBCUs are graduating African-American STEM graduates at a much higher rate than the predominantly white institutions. There was very little and no understanding, more or less questions asked as to what are the assets? How are you being successful here? It was, how do you become Googly and ultimately become Googlers? And so there was this, and I'm not saying it was done in a malicious way, but there was this lack of understanding of the assets of the particular culture and context. So, there's this belief, I argue, that if we, again, going back to what I said earlier from Jessica Ringrose, is if we can just simply get these poor African-American and Native American and Latinx and Asian American women to just be googly or just be ready for this particular context, we can do it. They can do it. So this can-do attitude has already been critiqued, particularly in girlhood studies by Anita Harris, because it sets up the belief that success is based on the individual's virtue of internalizing individualistic optimism, self-assuredness. And then how does this translate into program development, but something what I call the astronaut approach? And so we think about it. An astronaut puts on a bunch of stuff, equipment, and they go out to an atmosphere which is inhospitable, and you wouldn't necessarily survive. Well, a lot of program developers, well-meaning, are doing the same thing as it relates to particularly African-American, Native American, Latinx, and Asian American women. We're trying to build up the young women's arsenal to survive a hostile environment. We're not talking necessarily about changing the environment, and all too often we say, well, you know what? If you just know how to code, you'll be okay. If you know how to do that dissection, or if you know that particular concept or construct, you'll survive. In my mind, that's the astronaut approach, and it doesn't seem to be working very well if we go back to the first slide and the decrease of women, particularly women of color in computer science. So I say, and I get in trouble when I say this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. I say we need to blow up the system. It's not working. You can clap, we need to blow it up. I say it's almost as if we are knowingly and putting our children, our daughters, into a situation that we know is hostile, we know is inhospitable, but we say go there anyway. And I say, you know what, we can't focus our efforts in terms of populating, and I hate this metaphor, the pipeline. We have to blow up the pipeline. We need to provide our daughters and our sons the resources and opportunities to create a different system. Going back to intersectionality, there is no such thing as a level playing field. There is no such thing as a level playing field. And so for us to think that if we simply populate that field, that it'll become level, dismisses the importance of power, relationality, context. And so I say all this rather quickly in why I began the program back in 2007 called Compugirls. And I'm reminded of Ruth Nicole Brown's work, and although her work about Soul Hot is specifically about Black girls, I think her explication applies to all of the participants in the program called Compugirls. And I'm quoting Ruth Nicole Brown, where she says, too often, Black girls are seen as valuable for who they will become as presumable citizens in the making, not for who they are as people marginalized without the protections and privileges of being defined as an adult. It is the potential of the collective, the entering into relationship to build and create something beyond a self-serving good time. So when I and a bunch of my colleagues from across the disciplines got together to create this culturally responsive experience that's known as Compugirls, we were thinking about how to create an out-of-school, mainly out-of-school experience for girls that would encourage them to connect to each other and build coalitions. That would require them to be reflective of the institution, the system, that at times provides certain communities affordances and other times marginalizes, and how to unpack that in ways that, to the third point, draws on their assets, not their assets only as an individual, but also from the community. And so in doing so, we created, originally with 6 courses, but it's now turned into 4, where the technology and the digital media, whether it's the creation of storytelling or programming or virtual worlds or co-robotics, all of that is in the background, whereas the girls are focusing on how to move themselves in ways that can create that more just system. Mentor teachers are integral to the process, and they're a combination of parents, community leaders, in-service teachers, pre-service teachers. It depends on the context. And the mentor teachers go through a particular training, primarily virtual, but also in person, depending upon where the context is, where they are learning how to implement culturally responsive computing and the importance of intersectionality around those constructs of power, relationality, and critical activism. And so in the end, Compugirls has been this love child, which is saying we want girls in particular to become technosocial change agents. Technosocial change agents. In order to do that, we can't just focus on the girls. We need to think about the community. We need to include industries, peers, parents. We have a parenting piece to Compugirls and its later progeny, CompuPower, and teachers. And we need to think about how it's not only about learning those coding skills, but also what I call the power skills in order to become those agents and those leaders. And so, what I'm going to do, which I've never done before, and I'm so excited because you are my test, is because I'm in Illinois for the first time, I am going to, if you will indulge me, read certain portions of my book. I've never done this before, and no one's heard this. So I'm just going to read certain portions of the book to illustrate some of these points, and then return at the end to some takeaways. So. Is that okay? Okay. And you can be brutally honest, too. Okay, so I want to focus on 2 cases today from the book. One starts with Charlotte. At the time of her application, which was the spring of 2008, Charlotte was one of the youngest participants. Is it still showing up? No, no, I'm good. Thank you. She was 14, but she was really, really wise beyond her years. A reserved African-American girl, she was very tall, with her dark brown hair arranged in neat braids. With medium brown skin and small eyes, she rarely looked directly in anyone's face. Typically, she glanced at the floor during interpersonal associations. So it was really surprising to hear her clear, crisp voice, fully punctuating each consonant, enunciating each vowel sound as if individual words mattered more than the complete sentence. Listeners took notice of her speech, no matter its low volume. During the first Compugirl course, that was the storytelling, Charlotte tried to be invisible. Now, group work didn't pose a real problem, but neither her peers nor the mentor teacher seemed aware of her presence. More often than not, Charlotte would not contribute to the conversation, and no one invited her input. Occasionally, she would make mention of the technological capabilities of her immediate groups, because they worked in immediate groups and then larger groups, but then she would retreat into the shadows. For Charlotte, the self-imposed, marginalized space she occupied was one of silence. She determined when she would speak. When she decided to break her muteness, her peers listened and willingly followed her suggestions, even when they did not provide verbal assent. Example, when her group initiated discussions of how GarageBand could be used to make movies, Charlotte quietly but forcefully reminded them of this impossibility. Without lifting her eyes from the laptop screen, she said, "No, it won't do that. You need to play with the other thingamajig, the whole system." Her response may not have been the most pointed, and to someone who could not readily identify the thingamajig, her advice would seem fruitless. However, without turning their heads in her direction, the two speakers looked at each other and said, "Oh, that's right. We cannot use it for that. It's for music," referring to GarageBand. Okay, we need Photoshop to import and change around our pictures and use that as part of the movie. At this, a smile crept across Charlotte's face. Time and time again, Charlotte chose this communication style with her fellow Compugirls. In turn, a few girls approached Charlotte for assistance. She typically completed all of the technical tasks well before others. So then she would interestingly physically move herself next to an individual, dyads, triads, and offer her assistance in this way. Acting as if she was incredibly occupied by her own work, she would never directly intervene or hover over girls. She would always remain close enough to the discussions, but far away to seem unconcerned. And she'd quietly offer advice or guidance without narrowing the self-imposed physical divide. Barely above a whisper, her words sometimes seemed tentative, but they didn't necessarily denigrate the girls. They may say, "No, you can't do that," or "That's wrong," but her words were always accepted readily. And she continued to position herself to groups that she deemed in need. Even when she returned to the program after she completed, at that time, all 6 classes, which took an individual about 2 years, even when she came back as a peer mentor, she applied the same strategies. She did not directly intervene, and as a result, Charlotte continued to develop her agentic abilities well beyond the program's conclusion. Charlotte's space, the one in which she physically removed herself from individuals while remaining tuned in to their technological needs, provided latitude to ultimately become an activist. What I think is interesting is, unlike so many generic images of Black girls' actions and activism, such as the precursors to the seductive Jezebel, the emasculating sapphire, or docile mammy, stereotypes that we've heard way too often by scholars and practitioners alike, Charlotte developed her own script, one in which her quiet fortitude was neither controlled nor disdained. Without coercion from her groupmates, mentor teachers, or future Compugirls, Charlotte played out an antithetical image of Black girl activism, neither loud nor needing immediate control. She was afforded by the mentor teachers and her groupmates multiple and sustained opportunities to quietly challenge her sister Compugirls to become more knowledgeable. This opposes the myth that Barbara Monroe explains, that the dominant culture both maintains and perpetuates, that communities of color are technophobic and simply care little about technological innovation. Charlotte creates an interesting narrative, adding texture to what a technosocial change agent in a given context can be. In this sense, silence should be reinterpreted, or muteness or self-muteness, and not automatically perceived as a sign of weakness or defeat. Claiming one's silence assumes a different but equally agentic performance of subjectivity. Allowing Charlotte to physically position herself where needed, as well as redefine the power dynamics, where the adults were there in this context, but they were not the only bearers of knowledge. It granted the girls a different vision of critical learning and critical pedagogy. Now, I admit it's incredibly time-consuming for Charlotte to engage in this process, and a formal educational space, and I was a teacher in fourth grade, a formal education space in which most adolescent girls have, no more than 50 minutes, blocks of time, with a given particular subject. This would be very difficult to replicate. Nevertheless, Charlotte builds an interesting coalition around technological acuity through multiple, short, and powerful interactions. And although she navigates the room by herself, her movements are in concert with the needs of her peers. She builds a coalition and technological resistance, and does so in relative silence. So when we think about silence, I think back on Signathia Fordham's seminal work describing how school personnel, and later, more recent work, particularly by Kimberly Crenshaw, how Black girls are often coded as loud. And characterizing Black female student talk as loud is dismissive and pejorative, designed to assign a place, jailing, I argue, girls' actions. There's no accommodation made for enthusiasm or exasperation, but teachers lambasting Black girls without knowing, and in some cases caring, what they're talking about. If girls of color accept these markers, it is easier to pigeonhole and ignore the silenced girl. The dominant culture, and in this case its accessories, teachers, steal the voices of Black girls. They are unable to articulate their view of the world, and their perspective may be different from those of the teacher, their male counterparts, or white students. Silence in this case is not accidental, and its effects are seldom benign. However, for many girls of color, such as Charlotte, silence is a weapon. It can serve as a means to control successfully navigated space and create an alternative culture with its own norms. Silence can simultaneously be a key to our emancipatory identity, a vehicle towards self-discovery and transformation. It can also be a waiting device in hopes the enemy will give up and retreat, allowing us to do the work we know needs to be done. Silence can be a way for us to remove distractions from our line of vision so we can create the necessary coalitions to change society. And this is very dangerous work. Too many well-meaning teachers, program developers, community activists working in communities marginalized by race, gender, social class, and other variables They ardently believe that it's their duty to give voice to the voiceless. Assuming their intervention is, in part, a political move to free the marginalized from their silence, this form of supposed activism diminishes the activity of the disenfranchised. The danger of giving voice not only jeopardizes the activist's possibilities for making change, but limits scope and vision of what the change should be, fostered by the context and its inhabitants. Let me move on to the second case. So it begins with a mentor-teacher who I call Miguel, asking his small group, how are you guys going to do this movie, he says. He has incredible patience. He allowed silence to envelop the girls for more than 30 seconds. Amazing wait time. Only one participant, Diana, maintained eye contact with Miguel. Her long, straight, dark brown hair frames her light brown face, and she appears much older than her 14 years would suggest. Typically dressed in jeans and a short-sleeved t-shirt, her evenly cut bangs swung as she moved her head. In a soothing voice that rarely increased its volume, Diana provided thoughtful answers to any question. She was invariably polite, regardless of the group's unease or how harried the person asking the question seemed. Fluent in Spanish, she never spoke of her Mexican heritage until much later in the program. Not a recognizable leader among her group or the entire 38-girl cohort, Diana was very, very observant. She often enlisted the support of Rachel. Rachel was the only African-American participant in this particular group. Only 1 year older than Diana, Rachel was slightly taller with dark brown skin. Depending on the day, her hair appeared sometimes in afro puffs, sometimes in braids. Rachel normally wore bright or white-colored clothing. Like Diana, Rachel was not particularly loquacious. Her voice was deeper than most other girls in her group, but carried a certain gravitas, causing others to take notice. When posed a question, her responses were assertive and clear. She often made explicit references to research she had found, but maintained a critical eye, reflecting one of the key principles of the program, intragroup difference. For instance, Rachel would answer a question with, in this article I found in Eric, it said women are not in technology, but what women? Which women? There isn't anything in there that says anything about women who look like me or you. So how can I know if the suggestions are for me or not? Perhaps due to the newness of the experience, Rachel did not express this strategy until the conclusion of the second summer program. However, by the end of the third week, she consistently used this technique when the mentor teacher was frequenting the bathroom, getting water, or some other occasion requiring him, Miguel, to leave the group. Now, Miguel's brief absences caused the girls' energy levels to increase slightly. Few talked above a whisper, preferring to huddle close while one served as the belvedere, periodically looking up to see if he was returning. Is he back yet? At the moment of his return, silence resumed. And Miguel would ask, so what did you all decide while I was gone? Downcast eyes to avoid making contact with him became the norm. Even with Diana's direct gaze, he did not call on her. Nothing was decided then, he would continue, to which girls would mute themselves, assuming a silent persona. And this vexed Miguel. Questions hung in the air, blanketing the girls with a sort of heaviness too often detected in poorly run urban schools. And one day, Miguel literally walked out of the classroom and prepared to leave the girls by themselves and go home. In creating Compugirls, I envisioned it as a counter space, a context that was not like school and its conventional forms of teaching and learning. I had hoped with my personal professional coalition that we would have a learning space which would be ripe with occasions during which girls could safely interrogate themselves, each other, and the mentor teachers. I really did believe that through this type of learning, girls could create coalitions that would gird themselves against the social justices they research in order to create different types of just societies. At the same time, I was well aware of Angela Davis's point from 1994 that coalition building is more complex than simply stating the need for social change. To allow coalition building to occur in a form that may not resemble one's own preconceived notions, and to encourage mutable paradigms for developing and maintaining alliances across racial categories, this is the spirit I had hoped to take hold of the space. So to these ends, I really did believe that success in this digital age requires more than simply being technologically literate. But if we think about, in particular, Jessica Taft's work about youth activism and drawing on identity as youth, whereas youth are more often than not are considered, or at least their subjectivities as, and I'm quoting, an especially significant aspect of their collective political identities, and therefore the identity around which they most often focus their claims. And she continues in saying that this does not exclude youth activists from exclusively focusing on those types of experiences. Specifically, girl activists are concerned about many of the same issues as adults from similar contexts. But at the same time, when we think about particularly girls of color as activists, we get into the woods without seeing the trees, and we don't understand necessarily what does activism mean to them. Although Miguel had successfully completed a 3-semester-hour graduate course with me, he struggled to link theory to practice. How should he provide girls a space to define themselves without his direct intervention? The question seemed to trouble Miguel to the point of self-excommunication. And I say it's far easier to theorize and write about critical pedagogy, which he did exceptionally well, than to actually play out its tenets with real youngsters. Miguel was deeply offended by the girls' reactions, and he judged himself as a failure because the girls refused to follow his directions or nod in assent to his leadership position. As long as culturally responsive practices were concepts, they were abstract and without substance that invaded the classroom, it made sense to Miguel and many other mentor teachers. I'm not throwing Miguel under the bus. I see this more as an example of how we are challenged by how to prepare mentor teachers and in-service teachers with what we call culturally responsive practices. Because when teachers, and in this case Miguel, gave body to the ideas of cultural responsiveness, and Compugirls personified the elements of connectedness and reflection, it became very messy business. And then Miguel, as many teachers, felt under attack, and he gave up. He interpreted the girls' silence as disengagement, and therefore rejection. And rather than alter his practices or relish some of his perceived power, he gave up. He tried to be the version of a critical pedagogue and help the girls. However, he perceives the youngsters as the only individuals to make changes to themselves. It's difficult for adults, myself included, to unshackle ourselves from ideas that belittle the girlhood experiences of the marginalized. So change must include not only for the youth, but also for ourselves as adults. Bringing this together, both cases, when I think about both Charlotte and Miguel, the girls assigned to Miguel do for one another what Charlotte does for everyone. That is, they attempt to build their own activist agenda inclusive of self-sufficiency and accountability to individuals more than themselves. Although performed differently, other girls recognize and value their actions. The tension arises in how these different forms of activism and resistance are understood by surrounding adults. Miguel believes, like many educators, that in the cooperative learning space, there will be loud voices. Volume, in his mind, represents engagement. And when the girls redefine the space and do not create a loud context that's in continuous agreement with what he is directing, he codes their silence and their response as a lack of interest and disengagement. In doing so, not only do they resist, they meaning the girls, Miguel's expectations, but the belief that activism necessitates loud verbalizations. Systematically, the black and brown girls illustrated in these two cases are engendering habits of an activist self. These images may recall biased notions of the almost silent black girl, I admit this, but I think those tropes also discount the self-sufficiency that becomes so important to these and other Compugirls. Such interpretations often miss the nuanced nature of how these images emerge and the role of digital media, which is in the background as opposed to the foreground in these particular cultures. Without understanding that black girls, Latinx, Native American, and Asian American girls can be impactful in their quietness, that they may simply need a nudge rather than a direct push towards their own empowerment, and that resistance may include challenging the very efforts critical pedagogues construct. We will never potentially understand the level of noise silence can carry for current and future generations of activists. So the takeaway, and hopefully this will show, and what I would like to end with our charge is that power can be invisible. And that oftentimes it is. If anyone's watched Scandal, does anyone watch Scandal? Okay, like a few of you. I know you do, as you just may not want to admit it. And Rowan had a very long speech about power. Real power is often unseen. It reminded me that a lot of times when we're thinking about these issues of power and providing, in this case, girls of color, access and opportunity to gain power, to redefine the society, that it doesn't need to be demonstrable and loud. And that if we're thinking about which girls and girlhoods, we need to think more carefully about the both and approach and include technology in the background as opposed to the foreground of our initiatives. Because critical inquiry and critical praxis should be where space is left for girls to build the coalitions that they're co-creating. And this means we as educators need to ourselves have a coalition that crosses disciplines and boundaries. And that we as scholars need to ask more complex questions that are defined in far greater terms than simply how many girls of color are occupying a particular space, and consider that there might be some power in being as ungoogly as possible. Thank you.